I was born in the former Soviet Union in Moscow, Russia, in 1985. My mother was an actress and the daughter of Russian actor Sergei Alexandrovich Martinson, who was um, probably the most prominent actor in his respective field and genre of buffoonery, um, grotesque, and like parody. And my father was a film director, and that is how he and my mother met. And my father was also involved with organized crime, which led to his demise and death in 1992. Uh, and that was the cause of me migrating to the U.S. with my mother, which we had visited in 1990 to 1991, when my mother and father were separated, and then they reconciled, and we made the mistake of going back to Russia um, when we should have stayed in the States, where we visited Forest Hills, Queens, New York, uh, and that really created problems for us in terms of our immigration, because we uh, were looking at reapplying for our visa or extending our visa stay, and then working on citizenship, and going back to Russia kind of messed that up. And then my father's death uh, just really just put an end to any possibility of a future that I would have had growing up in Russia. And because we didn't stay in the States and we left and went back to Russia, that really um, made it more difficult to return to the U.S. And so we weren't able to go to the United States directly from Russia the second time, um, like we did when we had visited. So we illegally entered the United States through Mexico, because at that time we were only able to get a visa to go to either Argentina or Mexico. So we went to Mexico and entered illegally through Juarez into El Paso, Texas, and then caught a flight to Southern California, and then settled in Long Beach, California, where my mother remarried, and then we eventually got our citizenship. But growing up, I always wanted to be a police officer. I wanted to be law enforcement. So, like in Moscow, under the Soviet rule, we had a militia. That was the police. So it was a militarized police. They wore military uniforms. They didn't differ in how the military dressed, as they do now. Currently, there's a differentiation between conventional police compared to Russian military as of currently. Um, and also, it's important to note that I have family on both the Ukrainian and Russian side. Um, from my mother's side, her mother, my grandmother, was Ukrainian, or she was born in Ukraine and then migrated to Russia to be with my grandfather. Um, so I have no political bias or favoritism in the current state of affairs, and as such relates to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Um, so I grew up in Long Beach, California, resided in Southern California for most of my time in the States. Uh, I would later travel, but before getting to that, I grew up in Long Beach, and that's where I met my childhood friend, Kyle Gavin Berry, who was like a brother to me during those times, and somebody I considered a best friend, somebody I looked up to. He taught me how to skate and kind of like Americanized me, because he was really physically active, and so he was good, like at skateboarding, rollerblading, BMX biking, surfing, uh, and I really wasn't. Like I arrived literally. They have that saying that fresh off the boat. That's what I was. Like the way that I arrived in the U.S. I mean, this was a complete culture shock. We didn't have all of this in Russia, and I mean, I know how to adapt to my environment, but nevertheless, without a good role model, that would have been much more difficult. So I was blessed to meet his acquaintance because Kyle taught me pretty much of what I know, um, and really paved the way for me um, uh, in my career, which I would later pursue um, in the field of security contracting and law enforcement. Um, but growing up, I was a troublemaker. I would get in trouble often. That's where I gravitated towards music, and that actually kept me out of trouble. And then I began to pursue um, a career as a hip hop artist, rapper, musician, producer. Um, and that's where I learned so much of what I know in respect to the kind of criminal element within the hip hop community, uh, and in connection with drug trafficking in the United States, which uh, is perpetuated by what is known as an insider threat within the law enforcement and intelligence community, and selectively targets minority communities. And this is something that's been going on since at least the Nixon administration, and um, learning what I know um, along the kind of course of my experiences is what prompted me to further pursue law enforcement later on after getting away from the music industry. Nevertheless, I worked in an unofficial capacity and began investigating the Tupac Amaru Shakur murder um, sometime 2004. So that was one of my obsessions from an artist perspective. And actually, I remember sitting around with Kyle uh, and just drinking beers and, you know, talking about, like, hey, what if you could accomplish, like anything, and succeed in life, like what would you accomplish? And he asked me this. We would ask each other just kind of to get insight into one another. And I remember one of my responses was, I want to solve the Tupac Shakur murder because he was not only my favorite a rapper, but he was also like probably one of the greatest role models, or at least when we're talking celebrities, right? People with celebrity status that you admire and you gain encouragement from. That was one of my like like Tupac's like a guru to me. So I remember telling Kyle this, and Kyle has a background, or his family has a background in military and intelligence. So he he would bring up security contracting, and before I knew what that was, right? Because when we think about law enforcement, we don't really think about security uh, as a profession, because everybody wants to be a cop, and then security guards want to become police officers, right? But Kyle was talking about going to do some security contracting work in the Middle East, and then he later would and did for Blackwater. Um, about 2004, I began pursuing a music career um, in the hip hop community. So I was also working as a security contractor for special events within the music industry and entertainment as well. And um, by then, Kyle and I hadn't really communicated. We had a falling out about 2002. Uh, but then we would later talk um, uh, via telephone and social media prior to uh, what the official narrative of the media described as his death in 2007. Um, but the point being is that from about 2004 till 2007, 2008, I pursued music as a career and then retired by 2008 and would still make music part time. Um, but it was during the course of that experience in the music industry that I learned about um, the kind of corruption surrounding the murder of Tupac Amaru Shakur, Death Row Records as a label, the Rampart scandal with LAPD, and even going back before Death Row Records to the murder of uh, Captain James Sabow of the U.S. Marine Corps. If anybody knows who James Sabow was, he was a war veteran, U.S. Marine pilot, whistleblower who um, uh, gained the attention for talking about the U.S. government's involvement with narcotics trafficking and the use of military aircraft in the process thereof. And Captain James Sabow was said to have committed suicide. His family hired forensics. The forensics said, nope, Captain James Sabow did not commit suicide. He was murdered. And then the airbase where he was stationed in El Toro, which is, I believe, in Irvine, California, that was just shut down afterwards because the Department of Defense, the U.S. government, did not want to investigate the government's involvement with narcotics trafficking. It just didn't seem plausible. Wasn't important. Wasn't on their priority list. So we also had director CIA Director John Deutsch, who had met with members of the public, including former LAPD detective Michael Rupert, who had resigned from the LAPD as a result of the corruption surrounding the department. And Michael Rupert had mentioned to former CIA Director John Deutsch sometime in the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken, during this meeting that the Central Intelligence Agency was recruiting police officers as intelligence sources and confidential informants. But in the intelligence community, we call those intelligence sources. In law enforcement, you call them confidential informants. But the point is that the CIA was recruiting police officers as human intelligence, but really for the purpose of furthering narcotics trafficking in minority communities, because nobody is out there in those streets as much as cops are. Because who deals with criminals? Cops deal with criminals. So the Central Intelligence Agency, or at least the cabinet within the CIA that nobody wants to talk about, was targeting criminals or people that are criminally inclined. But I mean, really, that could be anybody in a sense. When you have poverty that the government, in a sense, or people within the government helped create by selectively targeting minorities, it's easy to take advantage of people's hardships that are struggling and suffering because of their environment. Uh, um, and to capitalize on that by making the drug trade and narcotics industry as an option for communities that are not economically viable, right? They're not well off like more prestigious communities, is just outright wrong, and that is not the government's job. But the government did this on record, and they did so under the guise of medical research. They're studying human psychology, right? So the way that the government or the Central Intelligence Agency would rationalize this is that uh, nobody's making people use or sell drugs, right? And we want to learn about human psychology. Well, if we put uh, drugs out there and people start selling drugs, that's their fault. But the point is that this was done systematically, and people within the Central Intelligence Agency and the intelligence community and law enforcement that were aware of this um, capitalized on people's hardships, beginning with South America and the kind of a chaos and turmoil that was going on there that we helped create, and then exchanged our surplus uh, um, firearms and arms and guns that we have here, and exchanged that for uh, the surplus cocaine, in Colombia, right? And imported that into the United States, selectively targeting minority communities, and in the process ruined Mexico, because Mexico plays into the drug trafficking scheme logistically, being Mexico connects the U.S. to South America, right, to Colombia and all those other Latin countries. Um, and then we get into Reagan and Oliver North, and the government knew what was going on. They knew this, and they were frightened of minorities, and that is the reason why the drug trade exists today, was because it is nothing more than guerrilla warfare. Simply put, it was their intelligent way of dealing with what they seen as a problem, and to the establishment, that problem was um, minorities. For example, J. Edgar Hoover, former director of the FBI, was just completely frightened of the Black Panther Party. He was terrified. Not because they were communists. It has nothing to do with that. These folks were all peaceful and they helped out the community. And why would they be capitalists when capitalism is not inclusive, and you have a capitalist system that's only inclusive to certain people that have connections or have a certain social status as it is, because they've had a head start. And why would somebody embrace capitalism when they're not included in that? So, I mean, to completely destroy a community just based on your fear of a people's the color of their skin, or even ideology, when these were not violent, um, uh, like guerrillas like we have in guerrilla warfare. These were not extremists. They were not violent until they had to be on the defense because they were attacked. But the point is that the entire war on drugs, as I've learned based on my experience in the hip hop community, which took me to different areas within Southern California, Northern California, and multi-state, and having met people affiliated with Death Row Records and Tupac Amaru Shakur, and learning about how the record label was founded by Michael Harrio, or Michael Harris, put up $1.5 million to establish Death Row Records as a label. Michael Harris was a convicted drug dealer. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration was well aware of Michael Harris and Death Row Records, and they allowed for Death Row Records to continue to operate, even though they knew that this money was that that was being used to finance the record company was um, drug money. It was money that was being laundered, and the reason why governments take so long to conduct these types of investigations is because this is something that's rationalized as for the sake of intelligence. So to find out where the drug source is coming from, where all this money that was being laundered through the label, we have to allow for them to continue to traffic drugs, as was the government agents' um, uh, strategy at the time, who were well aware of Michael Harris and Death Row Records and the drug trafficking and all that. And Reggie Wright Jr. and Sr. Reggie Wright Jr. was with the Compton Police. Compton PD was disbanded in about, I think, 2002. Reggie Wright Sr. was with the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office. Both were Death Row Records employees. Um, Reggie Wright was the director of security for the record label and was actually the one that told their security for Death Row Records to leave their guns when they went to Vegas, when the night that Tupac was assassinated. Reggie Wright Jr. and Sr. were indicted on federal charges. Um, uh, in 2017 on allegations of, I think, narcotics and firearms trafficking. So that just goes to show you how long they were able to operate as confidential informants or intelligence sources while on the federal government's radar, and they didn't get busted until 2017. And the more you look at the Tupac Amaru Shakur case, uh, um, and you bring up names like Jimmy Henchman, who was a confidential informant, drug trafficker, Haitian Jack, drug trafficker, and all these people that were involved with the East Coast and the Puff Daddy and Biggie camp. Um, these were all intelligence sources. These were all confidential informants that were allowed to operate as drug traffickers. They know what they're doing and they know who their handlers are. And that's why many of these people become so arrogant. They become so flashy and arrogant because they know that they have this kind of protection um, in their criminal activities. Uh, all the while, whoever these government agents are that are allowing for the continuation or the continuity of this drug enterprise, I mean, they're implicit. And in some way, shape, or form, they're profiting from this. Um, so that brings us to the casualty list as a result of um, Death Row Records as a label. So we had the murder of Tupac Amaru Shakur. That was actually said to have been planned for Reno, Nevada. Um, there was a rapper by the name of Little Half Dead, who's which kind of a Snoop Dogg affiliate, one of Snoop's peoples, or also known as Calvin Broadus, Snoop Doggy Dogg. Um, uh, had attempted to kind of ensue in a conflict with Shakur in Reno, Nevada, 1996, when Snoop Dogg and Tupac were in Reno for a St. Ides alcoholic beverage commercial, which they performed for at one of the local casinos in Reno. And actually, because of Tupac's status, his celebrity status, Vegas was not the best place for his assassination, but because there was so many other celebrities there for the Tyson fight and such, that's what I've heard from the music industry and people, kind of people's opinions on the matter, and people that were closely involved with Tupac, and law enforcement professionals. Um, Many of which agree that um, that was the reason why Vegas was selected, was because there was a special event in Las Vegas which involved other celebrities. So that when Tupac always attracted attention, so that would make Tupac, he wouldn't stand out as much, even though people loved him and he was famous, but it was that celebrity presence that would kind of like mask or camouflage Tupac's death in a sense, because of who he was, from an investigative perspective. Because keep in mind that the way that the general public perceives celebrities or like Tupac Shakur is going to be different than investigators, especially investigators that are good and do their job. It's going to be different. They're going to look at a situation. Hypothetically speaking, if we took the Tupac Shakur assassination, right, and we changed the venue and we said, okay, Tupac, what if Tupac got assassinated in Reno, Nevada, and not Las Vegas? Depending on the environment, he probably would have drawn less attention. If Tupac would have gotten assassinated in Las Vegas and there was no special event and no celebrities or none of that, the situation would have been different. It would have been more on law enforcement's radar, and somebody would have really wanted to investigate, and they would have gotten down to the bottom of the root cause of what led up to the murder of Tupac Amaru Shakur and Christopher Wallace. And Biggie was also murdered under the same or similar circumstances, right? When Biggie was hit in 97, was it March 9th? Right? Well, that was also, there was a special event going on. There was other celebrities present. So anytime that you're dealing with a celebrity, keep in mind they have they attract a lot of attention. So whoever planned the murders of Tupac and Biggie was thinking alike. I mean, there's definitely a pattern there, because they used venues where there's other celebrities. They didn't just run up on them like they would like a regular person that's not in the kind of public's view, and assassinate them. They ran up on them and carried out their assassination in an environment which included other celebrities, because that other celebrity presence would draw attention away from the murder. It's just, all you're going to be thinking about is like the shock value, right? Is like, it's like, oh my God, somebody shot Tupac. People aren't thinking about the environment. Why did they select that particular venue? Why, on that given time, that location? Because they wouldn't have been able to kind of hinder the investigations of both murders had those venues been different and not highly populated at the time with other celebrities. But the list of casualties in connection to Death Row Records, I mean, continues after Tupac Shakur was murdered. Yafi Fula, witness to Shakur's murder, member of the Outlaws. Also, believe he was also related to Tupac. He was murdered on the East Coast about 6 months after Pac was assassinated in Vegas, and he was the only person at the scene of the Tupac's assassination that was he was certain, he was adamant that he would be able to identify the shooter, Tupac shooter. Dwight Alexander, Shakur's bodyguard, died of a suicide in 2013. Johnny J, or Johnny Lee Jackson, Shakur's main producer, was brought up on like DUI charges and then killed himself while incarcerated. Um, Detective Russell Wayne Poole, Los Angeles Police Department. He was a detective. He was investigating both murders of Tupac and Biggie, and the police corruption surrounding both the LAPD and the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office. He died at the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office of a heart attack or something while talking to investigators giving testimony about on police corruption. Um, Michael Rupert, again, that was the LAPD former homicide detective who spoke with former CIA Director John Deutsch, although that was not related to the Tupac incident. That particular investigator wasn't investigating the Tupac and Biggie murders, but he was investigating the corruption that was, persisting from the Los Angeles Police Department, where the Central Intelligence Agency was said to have recruited police officers and members of the LAPD as intelligence sources, but for the purpose of furthering narcotics trafficking. And then the list goes on and on. The casualty list is, I mean, it's sickening that you can have so many people, many of whom were law enforcement, that have investigated the U.S. government, corruption within the government, and have inquired about the involvement of public officials within the DEA. For example, Enrique Kiki Camarena Salazar, and that was the DEA agent that was tortured and murdered in Mexico sometime in the mid 80s while inquiring into the involvement of DEA and CIA officials in Mexico as such relates to narcotics trafficking. So the list goes on, and what we've learned from the Death Row Records as a record label and their involvement with drug trafficking is that the source of this narcotics trafficking is all the same. So whether we're talking about Tupac Amaru Shakur, Death Row Records, or Puff Daddy, Notorious B.I.G., or we fast forward to the BMF case, the Black Mafia family, anybody familiar with that case, that was a kind of moniker or trademark started by two brothers out of Detroit who started off as crack cocaine dealers and then built a multi-million-dollar narcotics empire. They cut out the middle man, and they were going directly to the source of the cocaine, and they were allowed to operate. They were under surveillance by the DEA for at least a decade and allowed to amass hundreds of millions of dollars before finally being brought to justice. And then all of the wealth that they amassed, obviously you have a civil asset forfeiture process the government uses to seize those millions of dollars in assets. But the point being is that how many lives have been ruined with this war on drugs when all of this could have just been easily resolved by not using the justification of gathering intelligence, because that's something that, I mean, you in law enforcement and intelligence community, I mean, how that can be indefinite. We're trying to pinpoint the source of the drug problem, and we're indefinitely allowing for narcotics to enter the United States for the sake of finding out where those drugs are coming from, when we have a pretty good idea as it is. And allowing for minority communities to be selectively targeted and destroyed, disseminated. I mean, if anybody's been to South Central LA and you've seen somebody that's a crack cocaine addict, I mean, that's not pretty. It's no good. So What I've done is my research, and I've taken my combined experience within the music industry, working with the government and the United States Department of Justice in an unofficial capacity during the time of my pursuit of a career in the music industry, and using that as an opportunity to gather intelligence um, uh, during my inquiry into the murder of Tupac Amaru Shakur and Christopher Wallace, and the long list of victims as a result thereof, as well as my combined experience working for the state and federal government in a peace officer capacity, and having worked in the field of corrections and the prison system at a maximum security prison, and having gathered what's known as correctional intelligence on security threat groups, such as drug trafficking organizations, or what's also known as DTOs, prison gangs, and street gangs, and having worked for the federal government in the United States Department of Homeland Security, and as a security contractor for the United States government. Based on my knowledge and intelligence that I've gathered, I can tell you that there are people at the top level of the government that are implicit in the narcotics trafficking into the United States, with a emphasis of distributing narcotics into minority communities. And this has been going on since the Nixon administration, at least. And logistically, I mean, when you have an industry and logistically it's there. I mean, they have the channels to for the drug flow and the cash flow. The players change, but I mean, the market is there. It doesn't go away. It doesn't matter. You take out these drug dealers or drug organizations, more sprout up. And the harsh reality is that the United States is the cause of this. And I'm not saying all of the United States, but I'm saying that the U.S. has created that opportunity for malicious actors with a crony capitalistic system, not a fair and equal capitalist system that empowers everybody regardless of race, color, creed, or national origin or whatever, but a system that at the power structure at the core is very oppressive to other nations as well as to their own. There's talks of third world countries and poverty that we hear, this political rhetoric here in the United States, when we hear certain politicians, for example, kind of badmouth third world countries, when in fact you have places in the U.S. that are worse than any third world countries, that or at least some third world countries. I mean, if we're comparing poverty, if we take the worst poverty in the United States and compare that poverty or those communities affected by poverty with third world countries, there's third world countries that are better off than some places in the United States. And this is the reality. And, it's kind of this military industrial complex, and they're meddling in other countries' elections. Also, we can gather intelligence and have a presence everywhere in the world and just set up military bases everywhere. We're the police of the world. That creates this opportunity, because when we oppress other nations, which we have and do frequently as a country, the people that are oppressed are going to turn to whatever means are available in their environment for the sake of survival, even if that means narcotics trafficking. And so we can't really blame South America for the drug trade. And you can't blame the drug dealers in the U.S. or the low level, mid level drug dealers. Although two wrongs don't make a right, and people should make better decisions. But when we have a government that is for the people, by the people, financed by the people, right? Their job is to be a good steward. Otherwise, why are they making these kinds of salaries? Why are government jobs so prestigious? So, I mean, if they're making these kinds of salaries, then they have to be providing the work and the services um, for which the public is paying our government representatives for. And that's not something that's happening. That's not going on at all. Um, and so, with that being said, and the current kind of power structure and powers that be, and then their involvement with the free market, where them and their affiliates uh, profiteer from government contracts, for example. If you work in the government, you should not have a company that contracts for the government, right? If uh, you're Dick Cheney and you're vice president, you should have no association with DynCorp or Halliburton, who is a GSA government contractor, right? Just based on your public office. I mean, if that's not a conflict of interest, I don't know what is. So the source of this problem is all the same, and the ethical lapses that happen occur at the top level of our hierarchical model. So when we talk about government, that doesn't mean all government employees are bad. Just like not all Democrats nor Republicans, good nor bad, because there's a whole lot of hypocrisy going on. There's a whole bunch of rhetoric that our representatives will tell us to get our votes and to kind of appeal to their fan base in the same manner that an entertainer would to boost their record sales, right? So this is all psychology and just common sense. They're not gonna tell you what you don't want to hear when they know what the truth is. So I mean, at that point, they're not fit to be our representatives because you can't spew that kind of rhetoric of equality and government transparency and we the people elect the government and the government's elected by the people, and then I mean, which people are we talking about? Is it a certain group of people? Because it seems like there's only a certain kind of a group of people that governments benefit rather than all equally, and rather than you know um, truly delivering to those that are contributing the real work at the foundational level of the power structure. We often see that those people that help build society are the least rewarded. They're the most oppressed, and then the higher up the hierarchy you get, I mean, it's like a multi-level marketing scam. At every level that somebody's succeeding, there's somebody at a level below that's not as succeeding as much and is losing because they're being oppressed. You're not giving them the full knowledge, not the education, nor the dignity. So, um, it this is what I've learned in my experience. So, as somebody who's worked in the entertainment industry as a musician and as an investigator, um, as a intelligence source, and as an intelligence officer in a non-official capacity, and as a certified peace officer and a federal officer for the U.S. government. Having that kind of an experience and going from just growing up in the greater Los Angeles area in Long Beach, which is a diverse, multicultural community, coming from a middle class family, growing up as a troublemaker and dropping out of school to only later go back to school, get my GED, get my bachelor's, and to just acquire the kind of wealth of knowledge that I have, just collectively, from all these industries combined, from the music industry, security contracting, and law enforcement and public safety. I can tell you that there's this major problem within the United States government, and this is something that's within all governments. I mean, we're not just talking about the U.S. government, but for the sake of this argument or discussion, because we're talking about the war on drugs, the American government is a kind of at the forefront and a leader in the drug distribution, as such relates to the same war on drugs that we say that we're fighting. Now, there was recently a DEA agent that was arrested and convicted, and this was, I believe, a case that stems back to 2020 and kind of resurfaced most recently in the media. The former DEA special agent Jose Irizarry, who himself said in an interview with the media that the drug trade is like a really fun game, and this is how some law enforcement officials think that this is a game, because it's not a game. It's not a game for the people that are victims to this. And the ultimate victims are the children that are affected by this, whether their parents are drug users and or drug traffickers. So lives are being destroyed because of this, and when you find the source of the drug problem, with that is everything else. So everything that we have that's bad about our society, that when we talk about all the other crimes trending, from the violence, all the other societal problems like addiction, obviously that's a direct result of the drug trafficking, the child trafficking, the human trafficking, the trafficking of organs. This is all correlated to the narcotics trade. That's the problem, is the phony war on drugs, government's involvement, or certain government officials who are involved with narcotics trafficking, and the legislature and these politicians that kind of rather would tell people what they want to hear rather than the reality, that don't have the solution to go after the drug problem other than creating more laws. I mean, you can keep creating more laws to ban drugs. You're only making these outlawed substances on demand. This is it. So until we focus on that, and really address the real issues, like a lack of education in the United States, because if we had an educated people, we would have a healthy people, and if we had a educated and healthy society, we would have an intelligent society that would make much better decisions than we do currently as a people, as a whole. So I mean, that's just the reality of all this, and that's what I've learned. So when we go back to the music industry and we talk about people like 50 Cent, it's probably, in my opinion, one of the most influential hip-hop artists of my time, and an amazing role model as well. Definitely somebody that I would say people should aspire to, given his environment from which he came from, and his level of success. But again, that man he was shot. He was somebody wanted to assassinate him because of not because of his music, really. It was because of what he knew and what he said. And maybe his music was an outlet, but we have a problem in our society where we have like an anti-snitch culture in our society, where it's like if you're trying to look out for um, the betterment of humanity, if you're trying to improve people by speaking out against corruption, that's somehow viewed as like snitching or telling or ratting on people, and then you know, and then violence is somehow the solution to the people who want to silence really the oppressed. Because you can't say that it's all right that this is going on in our communities, and then we can't talk about what's going on in our communities, right? But it's okay that all of this drug trafficking is going on in our communities and in our society, but it's not okay to talk about the real problem. It's not okay to criticize the government or people within the government, because that's how governments maintain power, is by people keeping people gullible and you know, believing that they're there for your best interest, when in fact you have more and more. I don't care if it's one corrupt agent, that's one too many. That's more reason to not trust people. And so, you know, the entirety of all this is kind of built on that, is that we live in a society where, I mean, ultimately people want to be able to trust one another, and that gives them that sense of security, and they can go on about their day and be happy and pursue happiness, and you know, feel like the world is a great place to be a valued asset of this society. But um, that change has to start at the top. I mean, at the top level, when we have this kind of corruption, and we have these ethical lapses at the highest levels of government, uh, and people just can't release the information. They just can't tell people the truth. Just acknowledge. Just, you want us to trust you. Just acknowledge you've been trafficking the drugs. For those of you that have, I mean, your agency, somebody within your agencies has. Either that, or they have just a massive insider threat. Which, I mean, that's what those people are. If you're a government or a public official and you are engaged in the narcotics trafficking, and you have to use like encryption and code words and phrases to justify and rationalize your criminal activity by treating your drug trafficking activities as medical research, or using parallel construction. That's a term that actually was developed by the Central Intelligence Agency, and then later taught to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, and is a technique used to protect intelligence sources, but is also a technique that's used to traffic drugs legally and on paper. So the government has a systematic way that's legit on paper in regards to how they carry out their criminal activities, and that's wrong. So if you want to read more about this, you can read my book, which is called Tsunami, How Governments Traffic Drugs into Minority Communities, Political Corruption, and the Murder of Tupac Amaru Shakur. And this is basically something that I put together as about a 10, maybe 11, 12 page affidavit, which is kind of templated like a criminal complaint, and which has been submitted to various law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and is factual. This is not a hypothetical book. This is actually based on my experience um, as an investigator, peace officer, um, and intelligence officer, and in conjunction with my non-official um, activities as well, um, which began with the music industry in 2004. And really encompasses my overall experience in relation to the murder of Tupac Amaru Shakur, and how that's linked to the source of the drug problem, not only in the US, but internationally, as well as the kind of public corruption and where that public corruption stems from, giving names, times, places, and examples, including statements I've obtained from credible witnesses, and which is also further backed by other prominent cases and investigations into public corruption in connection with drug trafficking that was going on, places where I had visited and worked, people that I've actually met with and talked to, or people that were members of the community and the law enforcement community who were later indicted on drug trafficking charges, and with whom I have communicated and talked to, and have known just on a day-to-day basis, and having worked in the same or similar environments as the subjects being named herein, readers will get a good perspective on the war on drugs and what's really going on, and how something like this can even be possible in what is said to be the greatest nation in the world, and we're at the forefront, the leaders of the world, and then we have this going on in our society, and then people are still not treated equally because somebody wants to make a profit, because that's just the way it is, right? That's like Pac said, I made a G today, but you made it in a sleazy way. Oh, I gotta get paid. Well, that's just the way it is. I see no changes. So I encourage everyone to buy this book, and there's also an audio book that is different in its content, but deals with the same information, and has the same title as this book, which is Tsunami: How Governments Traffic Drugs into Minority Communities, Political Corruption, and the Murder of Tupac Amaru Shakur. So there's actually two components to that title. One is a ebook, which is downloadable and can be read, and the other is an audiobook, which is different in its content, but it is the same situation being described. It's just the audiobook is not me reading this document. It's just actually me sitting down and having like an interview like discussion, and which has been formatted as an audiobook and is available on the internet. So if anybody has any questions, y'all can always holler at me on Twitter, Twitter handle at NinjaVelli, or you can email me at anton@usci.cc, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions y'all folks might have. So thank you for tuning in. Really appreciate y'all out there, and until next time.